Hey there, I'm Jerry, a DIY track guy, and today we got to sort out what's up with the Exxon Valez over here. The other day when I took my Ecotec swapped Miata to the track, as the day progressed it became quite noticeable that its oil had gone from being inside stuff to outside stuff, and when I got it home it did a pretty good job oiling down the floor of my humble garage. Now, if you're up to speed on prevailing internet car mythology, you've probably heard that Chevrolet Ecotecs are trash motors that eat timing chains, blow head gaskets, and shoot rods out the block. Good thing the small but enthusiastic EcotecMiata community is filled with experienced car builders, fabricators, road racers, and track day bros that have experienced every conceivable problem of this motor in this chassis. So with my particular oil leak issue, there's some excellent suggestions on things to check and investigate. Oh hey, future me here, out on a test drive after doing all of the following stuff. And it occurs to me that what follows may seem like very Ecotec Miata specific stuff. And of course, yes, some of it is, but I think the stock Miata motors and this one are kind of designed in the same way. And in principle, these tips and suggestions should be applicable to you if you're trying to investigate and diagnose an oil leak in your Miata. And stick around to the end for the truly shocking oil leak fix that is the chef's kiss in terms of resolving my issue. You're gonna love it.
The first thing was to determine where the majority of the massive leak was coming from, and there was a pretty obvious culprit, a crank seal. Since the oil was coating the top of the oil pan under the hood and was dripping down the front of the motor, clearly it was getting onto the drive belt and pulleys and spring absolutely everywhere. So the first thing to inspect was the front crankshaft seal, which is behind the crank pulley. Unfortunately, to remove the crank pulley requires removing the sway bar and angling the radiator forward. This allows enough clearance to get at that 21mm crank pulley bolt that's torqued to about 75 foot-pounds plus 120 degrees. And once that long crank pulley bolt is loose, we need that extra space offered by getting the rat out of the way. Now we pull off that crank pulley and inspect the seal, and notice that it's barely hanging on. Obviously it was blown out. And here we are with the old seal on the bench, and here's the new seal. With a little bit of engine oil, we lube it up, get it into place on the timing cover, and carefully tap it in using the old seal on top to cushion the hammer. There we go, the new seal's installed and bottomed out in its home. And we just got to get that crank pulley back on and torqued up. After firing it up and idling for a bit, the new seal seems to be doing its job of keeping oil on the inside of it. So that seems pretty good, right?
After a cursory cleanup using several cans of brake clean and a roll of shop towels, this car is back on the road again, driving as it did before. But that doesn't explain why this motor is pushing the front crank seal out while turning laps on the racetrack. The obvious reason for seals blowing out is excessive crankcase pressure. There's a lot of good information on the internet about this subject, but in the simplest terms so that even I can understand, it's about fuel, air, and spark hooking up in a cylinder, getting all hot and bothered, making that sweet explosive goodness that we all know and love. In a healthy motor, that sensual expanding gas would be mostly contained within the combustion chamber, but some of it does escape past the piston rings, and that's called blow-by. All engines experience this, but if there's too much blow-by, that can result in introducing high-pressure gas into the crankcase, and that's not good. So to check if that's a problem with this junkyard engine, the standard procedure is to perform a leak down test. So let's do that.
And of course I had to buy a tool from Amazon. This is a leak down tester kit. Here's the dual gauge manifold that shows the input air pressure on the left gauge and the percentage leakage on the right. On the bottom is this pressure adjustment regulator that locks into place. And this is the hose that screws into the cylinder being tested on one side, and on the other it has a standard air hose disconnect fitting. First we need to zero out the gauge by connecting up our shop air. On the other side we connect up a generic blowgun. Then we release a bit of air and using the regulator adjust the pressure gauge to 100 psi. When we release a bit of air with the blowgun, the pressure drops but the gauges return to 100 psi and 0% leakage as they should. And now the leak down tester is ready to go. Over on the engine, we remove each of the 4 ignition coils and their spark plugs. Now we need to find top dead center for cylinder 1 on the compression stroke by inserting a tool into the cylinder and rotating the crank with a wrench until the piston reaches the top of its stroke. Then we screw in that hose into the cylinder, connect the leak down tester, and check the results on the gauge. This cylinder reads about 3% leakage on the right gauge and about 97 psi on the left gauge. And because we adjusted the input air pressure to 100 psi, the math is easy, meaning we have about 3 psi leakage on this cylinder. Then we simply repeat the same procedure for each of the other cylinders following the firing order, which for this motor is cylinder 1, 3, 4, then 2. Here are the leak down numbers alongside the compression test numbers that I took earlier in the season. If any of the cylinders had a leak down of more than 8%, that would be less than ideal, but more than about 20% would be a cause for concern. But as it stands, these numbers look real solid, indicating good piston ring and valve seals across all cylinders, which should mean this motor isn't producing significant or excessive blow-by.
Now that we've changed out that front crankshaft seal and done a leak down test, the next thing on our list to check is under here, using one of these.
We need to align the power plant frame or PPF that ties the engine, transmission, and differential together as a unit. This is often an overlooked job that's recommended whenever the transmission is loosened or separated from the PPF to ensure the drive line is within specification. And we'll see what this has to do with the oil leaks in a moment. The procedure is to get under the car, take a straight edge, and place it across the frame rails. Then measure the distance from the top of the straight edge to the bottom of the PPF. And the spec is from 60mm to 71mm. Since I'm running these frame rail reinforcement braces from R-Theory Motorsports, I take into account their thickness as they're like another layer of metal on top of the frame rails. Initially, I measured 56mm, which means the engine and transmission are sitting a couple of degrees off spec, higher at the front of the motor and lower at the back. To fix this, these 17mm transmission bolts need to be loosened but not removed, but I noticed the short bolt to the bracket was missing. More on that in a sec. We also need to loosen the engine mount to subframe bolts, which are recessed in these cups here and here. And about that missing bolt, it was back ordered from Mazda Canada, so I replaced it with a grade 8.8 M12 1.5 thread pitch bolt for $4 from a local supplier called Bolts Plus. Although it's a 19mm hex head instead of the 17mm OEM one, I was super happy I could source something to get it back together right away, so Bolts Plus came in clutch for me. Next, we place a floor jack under the transmission and raise it until it's at that 60 to 71mm spec. I stop once I get to about 70mm, then I tighten the transmission and engine mount bolts back up to spec. The EcotecMiata engine swap kit includes a custom oil pan that looks like this. Now, I understand it's a bit sensitive to being overfilled, so there's a specific procedure to fill it properly. When filling the sump from empty, you're supposed to level the engine and add 5.5 liters. Yes, level the engine, not the car. Here we have the car leveled in my very not level garage as measured on the pinch wells. But if we put a level on the valve cover or on the top of the oil pan, notice that even after aligning the PPF, it's still ever so slightly tilted rearward about a degree. So I jack up the rear of the car a bit more from the diff to level the engine, run the engine for a minute, shut it down for a minute to allow the oil to settle back into the pan, and finally top up the oil to about 3/4 of the way up the dipstick.
So why did we need to do this? Well, according to EcotecMiata, if there's excessive oil in the sump, under heavy braking events, the passage at the front of the oil pan into the timing chain gallery can become blocked with oil. Then the flow of air in the crankcase or windage now has an obstruction causing pressure to build and potentially cause a blown out seal. This seems to only be a concern for EcotecMiatas that road race or, like me, are driven with brute force and ignorance on a casual track day. Next up on the oil leak hit list is to investigate further into that positive crankcase ventilation system that we've referred to a few times now. The primary purpose of the PCV is to allow unwanted gases to escape the crankcase, and usually there's one or more ports on the valve cover that goes to an electronically actuated valve or solenoid, and the other end goes to a vacuum source on the intake. That allows those gases to be drawn into the intake charge to be burned or recirculated as part of the combustion process.
Now, I eliminated the PCV solenoid, routing a hose directly from the valve cover breather port to a catch can so that any oil in those gases can be filtered and accumulate there. Then the de-oiled air is directed out of the catch can through this hose to the intake. In this spot on the air filter, there should be less vacuum compared to a port closer to the throttle body. To make sure the PCV is working properly and the gases are vented unobstructed out of the valve cover breather port, we can apply some compressed air into the dipstick tube and listen for air rushing into the intake. Although I've been running this catch can since I did the swap, I was advised by my new Ecotec Miata friend Jeff that I should try running a different oil filler cap. Here's the one I was using. Notice how it's just a solid piece of plastic with an O-ring. And here's the new one, which is a vented oil cap. It's a multi-piece unit with this inner white portion that's able to vent excess crankcase pressure. Let's give it a try. Now, we mentioned that valve cover breather port a couple times, but we didn't mention how anything works in there. If it was just a straight hole directly into the valve train area, actual oil could be pushed through the port, which is probably not a good thing. So notice how inside there's this baffle plate with a couple of small passages to encourage the unwanted gases, but not the oil to exit the breather port. Much like my latchkey childhood, this motor has led a pretty tough life of loneliness and neglect, as evidenced by the dark staining and carbon deposits throughout its innards. So it's possible that under this baffle there are obstructions preventing optimal flow. Maybe. So that's why I'm replacing it with this. I got this from my local pick-and-pull junkyard and was astonished by how clean it was. After a coat of paint, it's looking pretty awesome, and its PCV baffle should be clean as a whistle. Now that we've fixed that crank seal failure, tested for blow-by, addressed the oil capacity, and sorted the PCV, the last thing to do is to see if this solved the problem. Now, to do that, my friend Bears reminded me of a great way to pinpoint the source of oil leaks by using fluorescent leak detection dye. And over here we have 30 milliliters of ACDelco fluorescent dye that's used in oil and oil-based fluid systems. And of course we need a UV light of some sort. This is a 100 LED UV flashlight that takes 6 AA batteries. I don't know if this is picking it up on camera properly, but on this white piece of paper, this dye is glowing a bright orange under this UV light. The fluorescent dye is added directly to the engine oil, and then we start and idle the car to distribute it throughout the entire system. Using the torque app on my phone connected to a Bluetooth OBD2 reader, we monitor the oil temps and search for leaks under the UV light. This goes on for about 20 minutes as the motor reaches proper operating temperature, and so far so good. We don't see any glowing predator blood or trails of oil anywhere.
If you've made it this far, you rock. Please consider dropping a like or a sub if you haven't already to support the channel. Much appreciated. And there we have it, a number of tips to help diagnose and investigate oil leaks on your Miata. Replace a crank seal, do a leak down test to see if you have excessive blow-by, align your PPF and level your engine, fill with the proper amount of oil, and install a catch can and check your PCV system. But hey, if you have other tips on how to fix an oil leak like this, I'm all ears, please drop a comment. So hopefully that fixes my oil leak issues, but we won't know until I get it back onto the track again, which will be in an upcoming video. Until then, you're awesome. I'm useless. Thanks for watching.
And after a few weeks of battling small oil leaks in my modified custom oil pan, this is my life right now. Now it looks like I emptied 3 tubes of RTV on this thing, but I assure you I only used 1, slathered on like caulking a bathtub, in the dark, with my left elbow. Though this Permatex Right Stuff RTV is crazy good at sealing against oil and cures in only 90 minutes. So yeah, I'm not proud of this, but short of pulling the oil pan and re-welding all the suspected pinhole leaks, this is my best and only option. Wish me luck, guys.